start with a little more biography on you, Donald. You were born in Chicago, and you actually were an American history major at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and you were an anti-war activist as well. You went on to study ceramics and get your MFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art, and you won 3 National Endowment for the Arts grants, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an award from the American Academy of the Arts and Letters, also the Rome Prize of the American Academy in Rome. Anything I'm missing?
Okay. I don't think so.
Okay, and about 10 days ago, it was announced that your sculpture, The Cloud, was recognized as one of the nation's outstanding public art projects by the Americans for the Arts. So congratulations.
Thank you.
It's on the cover of these, which I think there are about 10 of these circulating. Okay. Your work is in the permanent collection of the Met, the Corcoran, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Manil Collection, the Whitney, the Walker, about 50 other institutions. But of late, you have been creating large-scale public artworks.
Right.
And you live in New York City and Amagansett.
Right.
Great. This is all true.
All true.
Okay. What I found really interesting when I did a studio visit with you last week is that you like complexity. So you said in an interview, things that are easy are not really fun for me. So one of the first pieces that you were really known for was at the project room at MoMA. And that was an installation from 1979 called Gathering Dust. And it was a collection of thousands of tiny little sculptures that you made by hand. Sort of like when you're sitting in a restaurant and you start playing with the lemon rind, or you start, braiding the matchsticks. Little tiny objects like this, but thousands of them pinned to the wall, certain distance, equidistance apart, just filling an entire space. And I feel like this was the genesis of everything for you.
That's good.
Okay, so tell us about Gathering Dust. I know it was at Artist Space first, was seen there, and then it was requested for the project space at MoMA.
Well, when I was a little kid, I was making things like this. All my life, I've been making things like this. I'd be sitting out in the yard, and I would take a leaf and try to peel off the flesh, just leaving the veins, or stuff we've all done. I'd take a lifesaver and try to not bite it until it was like the thinnest little circle. When I got to graduate school at Cranbrook, I started saving these things, thinking that they had something to do with art. I didn't really know what yet, but not that long afterwards, it occurred to me, they just are art. They're little sculptures. They're little, insignificant, maybe, modest sculptures. And I started showing them, just pinning them to the wall. And as there became hundreds and then thousands of them, I would just put them all up. I think it's on the last page.
On the last page.
Here was the installation at MoMA. I had a lot of rules for myself for making these that I wasn't really aware of at the time. I had a rule that I didn't use any tools. I had a pocket knife that my father gave me that I used to carry, that I would not take it out and use it to cut something. In fact, when I had my first show of these at a gallery in Dallas called Delahunty Gallery, and I was introduced to the director there by this guy, Raphael Martini, and he said, to Murray Smither, the director, he said, "Oh, you have to meet Donald. He makes art with his teeth." Because I wouldn't use the knife. I would cut things. I had a rule that if it was too big to fit in the palm of my hand, I wouldn't save it. And just day before yesterday or something, I came across an interview with an artist named Wade Saunders that was in Art in America in 1984. And what I was talking about there was getting rid of my rules. And I thought, this is a story I ought to tell. So this is a good opening for it. I was asked to go to, hi. There's so many friends, wonderful artists that I know, people who've come from far away, Southampton, you know, Quogue, Columbia, the country, you know. So, you know, thank you all. I was invited to go to Bulgaria. The U.S. Information Agency had a show that was touring around Europe, around Eastern Europe. And at that time, they were thinking of having a show called New York, Moscow, where Moscow artists would come to New York and U.S. artists or New York artists would go to Moscow. And they thought, well, to do this, we have to actually have artists go and interact. The show I was traveling with was really works from the 50s and 60s. It was Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and, you know, brand name artists. But they chose me to go with Gathering Dust, which is what these little sculptures are called, and hang them up. And in the course of this, I spent about a week with the artists in Varna, Bulgaria, who are all members of the Artists Union. And I had an interpreter and spent a lot of time talking with them. And what I came away from there with was that they were frustrated because they were operating under a burden of lots and lots of rules, some of which they were aware of, some of which they didn't really know. It's a communist country at that time. They were, by and large, all printmakers, because printmaking was a good socialist art form. Their subject matter was scrutinized and everything. They had just had this burden of rules. When I came back from that trip, I brought two things that I had picked up on the trip. One was from a department store in Sofia, which was a dumbbell, like for exercising, that with a curved handle, and it was shaped like a telephone receiver. And the other was a walker that I got at a flea market in Berlin, this beautiful wooden walker, like a four-legged cane. And I came back from that trip, and I had, for some reason, my phone was not working. Maybe I hadn't paid the bill. I unplugged the phone from the wall, and I put this dumbbell on top of it, and I put it on my floor, and I had the walker next to it. And during the months and really years afterwards, I got rid of, consciously, all my rules. Every time I thought, this is not what an artist should be doing, or this is not, doesn't make sense to me, or whenever I realized I had some rule for what I should or shouldn't be doing that I had just made for myself, I would cast it aside. And so I was just making things pretty mindlessly. The work I made during the next year or two, I called passing time, because that was all I really knew about what I was doing. I was passing time. And it was incredibly fertile time for me, and I think informed a lot of what I've done ever since.
I wish you could teach that, how to let go of rules and not, you know, be self-conscious about art making, because it seems like the more academic the studio programs become, the more very, very conscious artists of what they're doing and how it relates to the canon of art history. And it was really nice to go to your studio and see a box full of these twisted pieces of leaves and nuts and everything else that you've kind of found and assembled. Are you thinking at all about, if we go to art history, like Picasso's collages or the Surrealists or Duchamp's found objects or anything like that?
I'm not now. I can't really say if I was earlier on. I know there are a lot of artists that I've had tremendous admiration for that certainly influenced me. The classic is Picasso's handlebars and bicycle seat, that make a bull's head. And everything Duchamp did, really, I first became aware of him when I was in graduate school, and it was really like a kick in the head. It was an incredible revelation that someone was just thinking so freely and transgressively in a way.
The other thing that impressed me is that you are an enormous collector of stuff. And you don't
tell my wife.
And you don't have this fear of being like overburdened by it. You were telling me, I have this stored in a container over there, and then a truck full of these things. And I really fell in love with this statement by Donald Cuspit, which is in the Book of Knowledge. And these are also catalogs and publications on Donald that you can take a look at. So he writes, meaning Donald's, poetic objects are made of the dregs of thought as well as of things, of whatever has lost its place in life and found its place on the street, with no hope of making it into the museum of mind or beauty, no wish to do so. Lipski says he starts with the junk store or street-found objects so impoverished they have sunk beneath the contempt of ordinary usage. They obviously exist to be given new life through art. So I think one of the first things that you talked to me about during our studio visit was the glass fittings, the plumbing fittings that you came across. That was sort of an early series of work. So these are these clear glass fittings. Are any of them in here?
Yes, there's a successor to that. Here. This. These are called 200-liter boiling flasks that Corning makes. And this piece is actually at Corning headquarters in Corning, New York. My studio was at the corner of Greenwich and Canal. It was a 6th floor walk up. And every day I would go to breakfast at this place, the Market Diner, that no longer exists. And at the time, the neighborhood was changing from being little warehouses and little factories to becoming living lofts. And so every day I would pass dumpsters full of remarkable things that were being thrown out, often in quantity. One day there was a full dumpster full of paintbrush handles. And I made some pieces out of those. Yeah, some critic wrote, and Lipski cuts the bristles off of the paintbrush handles, emasculating them or some stuff like this. I was just wondrous that there were I carried as many up to my 6th floor walk up as I could. There were log books from a silver assayer with all these handwritten notations. There were just all sorts of wonderful things. So I started just finding all this stuff that I thought was provocative and that I could make stuff out of. I would also walk up and down Canal Street, and there was great stuff on Canal Street. And I started going farther and farther. And once I discovered in Jersey City a place called Sadowitz and Sons Junk with Class and Ambience. That's what it said on the sign. And they spelled junk Q-U-E, J-U-N-Q-U-E. And I got to know the family. They were wonderful. And when they were clearing out a factory that was going out of business, they would call me up. And I would go there with a truck and fill up. So one time I'm going through their place, and there was a cardboard box about this big, and it had 3 little pieces of glass pipe and a couple stainless steel fittings that clearly fit onto those pieces. I didn't know what they were, but it was made by Corning. It said Corning on them. And there was something coming up called the Chem Fair, which is the chemical processing industry's trade fair at the Javits Center. So I went to the Chem Fair to meet the Corning people and find out about this stuff. The guy I met had actually invented corian. Yeah, which he got a promotion for doing that. You know, he became like vice president of something. But Corning owned it, you know. And so I found out this stuff is called acid waistline tubing. And it's just plumbing pieces that are made of glass instead of made of any other piping material. And they were used in the chemical processing industry and in food processing and so forth. And I had a show coming up at something called the Danforth Museum outside of Boston, that they were actually giving me a budget to buy stuff to make the show. And I bought a bunch of this tubing and fittings and started making stuff out of it. Eventually, I had the idea that I could put organic matter in there, like flowers and herbs and eggs and fruits, like pickling. My studio at that time was in Brooklyn, and there was a company I found in Brooklyn called Universal Preservachem that I worked with a scientist there to devise a formula of stuff that was not noxious to deal with. His first thing is you should use formaldehyde, but you know, you should get a respirator, you should get rubber gloves and all this, and I'm just not that kind of guy. So we figured out a formula that had stuff that's in shampoo and that's totally non-toxic to work with. And I made a bunch of things out of those.
There are a lot of videos of you online working on your public artworks, and it sounds like you enjoy working with engineers, chemists, people who are really expert at problem solving. So tell us about some of those relationships, since you've named this chemist who you worked with on the early works.
Okay. Geez, what's a good story about that? Making public art is a very different thing than making work for galleries and museums. You're basically given a site and a budget. And these things are generally competitions. So it's blue sky. I think, what's going to be really great to be there? What will liven the place up? What'll be a real experience when you see it? We'll be transporting. We'll have the possibility to make this place a real location people will want to go to, would delight people, transform it in some way, really elevate it. And there's no rules, you know, except unlike making Gathering Dust, where, you know, my only rules are self-imposed, the rules there are in public art is it has to be as close as it could be to maintenance-free. It can't have any dangers. It's got to comply with Americans with Disabilities Act. You've got to involve engineers. It's got to not fall apart in 20 years and all that sort of stuff. So when I have a project, I end up working with definitely an engineer, different sort of fabricators. I'm doing a piece now that I'm working with a fabricator in Wisconsin that I've worked with twice before, that their stock in trade is making things for water parks, making water slides and big fiberglass things that get really hard use. They also make like big bulls that go in front of steakhouses and things like that. They made a Jolly Green Giant for something that was, I think, 100 feet tall. You know, they're capable of doing anything in fiberglass. I did a piece, this is a good one, at the Miami airport. And my experience with an airport is you get to an airport, and I travel a lot, and they all look and feel the same. You really don't know where you are. So this was Terminal D, a new terminal they were building, and it was the International Arrivals Terminal. And mostly people are coming there from South America and from the Caribbean. And I thought we should, it should be filled with fish that live in the waters around Miami. So doing some research, I found a guy named Mike Kirkhart, who's in Stuart, Florida, who's a taxidermist. And taxidermy these days is less and less about stuffing the skins of animals you get. And at least in fish, they still do that. They call them skin mounts. But more and more fishing is catch and release. You'll catch a marlin, and you'll take your picture with it, and then you let it go. And then you go to Mike Kirkhart and you say, well, I caught this marlin, and it's 14 feet long. I let it go, but I want one that looks like it to put in my den. And so he would make that for you. So this guy, Mike Kirkhart, 3 times won the award for the world's greatest taxidermist. And he's a real artist. So I worked with him, and we used, I think, about 50 different kinds of fish and made casts of about 500 fish that I put together into about 100 sculptures. That there would be like 3 big fish that are put together in a triangle, or 10 fish that are put together in a circle, or things like that. So when you look at them, they're just like abstract shapes that then I put them all over the walls. They're on like a dozen walls in this terminal. So that was a great thing, working with, I never would have met this guy or wouldn't have found fish like that to use.
How do people like this taxidermist from Stuart, Florida, how does he react to your work? I mean, it's almost a form of community outreach when you're translating, you know, a conceptual or permanent public artwork for engineers or for craftsmen.
Yeah, he understood it immediately, and I think he loved it, and he participated in it. I'd say, you know, let's take these and put it together like this. And he'd say, well, you know, if you use the skipjack tuna, then you'll have these tails that show that it would look like that. And I'd say, great. So it was really very collaborative.
Great. So he made some aesthetic suggestions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did a second piece with him that might be pictured in here. Yeah, in San Antonio, it looks like this. they were extending the Riverwalk. The Riverwalk is in downtown San Antonio, and it's below grade. Here's the streets, and you walk down staircases, and there is this walkway that's along the river. Wow. Okay, great. So, a few. There's some Texans here.
Good. Go Texas.
It was done during the WPA, and it's full of little cantinas and bars and restaurants and tourist shops, and it's just delightful. So some years ago, they decided to extend the Riverwalk up the river another couple miles, and they involved a lot of artists. I think they had like 8 or 10 artists who were doing different things along this stretch of river. There was one point where it goes under I-35, a 6-lane highway, and they thought that it was going to be a dark, spooky space that would be sort of forbidding, and people would get up to that point and then turn around and come back, and that would be as far as they would go. I went down to visit it. They had the river drained. They had it dammed up at that point because they were doing construction of this river walk, and I thought it was a beautiful space. It's got all these pillars that hold the highway up, and to me it felt like a cathedral. And I got the idea, probably because several years before I had done this project with Mike Kirkhart. I thought we could have a school of fish swimming under the highway. My first thought was they would be goldfish, and they would be giant goldfish. So in meetings with the public, which happens a lot in this public art thing, you get input from people who know the area better than I do and really have knowledge I don't. And I try to stay open-minded to what they're thinking. What I was hearing from them is, I don't know about goldfish. Why don't we do some fish that lives in the San Antonio River?
There are probably some goldfish in there.
There probably are.
Well, I know that in the bayous there are a lot of pet fish and koi and things like that. But.
And there's alligators in the sewers in New York. So there's a fish there that's called the long-eared sunfish that they grow to about this big. And they're beautiful. And the other thing that I found really interesting about them is when a kid is first learning to fish in Texas, not just in San Antonio, but really all through central Texas, it's probably the first fish they'll catch using a pole and a worm. So I thought it would be great to make 7-foot long, long-eared sunfish. So that's what we did. And they light up at night, which was a challenge for Mike Kirkhart because you can't, fiberglass is not translucent in any beautiful way. We had to find a new way to make them so that they would really look beautiful lit up. And now, underneath this highway, there are schools of, if schools is the right word, there are masses of bats that live in the nooks and crannies under the highway. And people come to this site at dusk, and
they come to see
They
bats
come to
and the
see,
fish.
first all the bats fly out,
Yeah.
and then the fish light up,
Yes.
and everybody applauds.
Yes. That is
And-
a distinctly Texas thing.
Yeah, and then
because
they go to the cantina.
every city in Texas hopes for a bat colony.
Oh.
Because then you get your lawn chairs out, you get your cooler,
Yeah.
you bring the kids, and you
Watch
wait
the
till
bats come
sunset,
out.
and then this majestic event happens.
Yeah, Austin has great
Austin
bat
and Houston does
colonies.
too now.
Oh, I
Yes.
didn't know that.
Yes, Houston has a bat colony. Yes.
Nice.
So I want to go back to the 70s a little bit in this mention of you being an anti-war activist. And I don't know whether this comes from that or just your interest in working with a material until it finds some kind of logic, but you did a whole series with flags. You did flag balls, you did the intersecting flags, which was at the University of Pennsylvania. Where was that
It
one?
was at the Corcoran.
At the
in
Corcoran.
Washington.
You did woven flags. And we have an entire catalog of flags from the fabric workshop. So this is, I think you told me, the only work that was ever vandalized, right? Was
Yeah.
this flag
Right.
ball,
I'm
which
trying
was
to
vandalized
think.
right here on Long Island at CW Post, right?
Right. Well, going back to the war days in the 70s, my fraternity brother, who I haven't seen since then, is here, which is great. I was at the University of Wisconsin from 65 to 70, and it was an intense time. There's a great movie about it called The War at Home. And I believe this year is the 50th anniversary of the Dow demonstration. Dow Corning was interviewing on campus, recruiting people to come work for Dow, and Dow made napalm. So students took over the building where they were interviewing. This was not the first thing I was involved in, but that one really ended in a bloody battle between police in riot gear and lots of tear gas and lots of people going to the hospital and making runs to ferry people out of the city, and a lot of adventures at that time. The flag things came about, I think, in 1989. There was an election year coming up, and some Congress people were starting to say that there should be a law against flag desecration, which this went back to the Vietnam era when people were burning flags. You know, maybe a few flags got burned. You know, it wasn't like a common thing that there was flags being burnt all over the country, but it was a rallying cry for certain reactionary politicians. And the way I thought about it was, if there was a law against flag burning, then I could use anything. I'm making art out of anything that comes my way. There would be this one thing that's sort of forbidden. I cannot make art out of flags. And that seemed un-American. It just didn't seem right. So about this time, the Fabric Workshop, which is this great institution in Philadelphia, which works with artists to make things out of fabric, asked me if I wanted to do a show. And I said, yes, I'd like to do a flag show. And they said, great. And they started constructing flags for me. And at the same time, they put me in touch with a flag company in Philadelphia called the Humphrey Flag Company that provided me with lots of flags in material form, like bolts of flags that had not been cut up. In fact, there's a week before last, or maybe it was the week before that, I have 2 trucks that are parked in Southampton at North Sea Radiator that I've been storing stuff in since, when did we go to Philly? You know, like 10, 12 years ago. And the guy who owned the place died, and I had to consolidate all the stuff from 2 trucks into 1 truck that's now going to be moved someplace else. Well, among them I found a bolt of flag fabric, you know, so that's a digression. But I filled my studio with flags and started using them like I would use any other material, and was wrapping them around things and making things with them and so forth. So one of the things I made was this flag ball, which I think is about 9 or 10 feet in diameter. And we couldn't make the whole thing out of flags, but we made a styrofoam ball about 8 feet, and then covered that with Dacron batting, and then covered that with flag material. Now, the only flag material that I could get in that sort of quantity that they would give me was nylon flags. And so I had bolts of these nylon flags, and I made this at what's now called Adelphi University. It was then called Beaver College, out in the suburbs of Philadelphia. What?
I went there.
Great. Did you have like a t-shirt that said Beaver? What? Arcadia. Okay. Thank you. And I had a bunch of people rolling this ball, and I was like guiding it and wrapping it on there like you're making a ball of string. And I made so much stuff with this fabric workshop that it couldn't fit in one place. So we had exhibitions at Beaver College, at the Fabric Workshops galleries, at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and at the Corcoran, which at the time Terry Sultan, who's the director of the parish, was running the Corcoran then. Okay, so the show came down, and I had this piece, and it was made out of this shiny fabric that I thought just wasn't quite right. So I knew this woman, Judy Kalashan, who was running the program at C.W. Post College. And I asked her if I could leave it on campus there, and she was delighted to have it. So every couple months, I would go there, and I'd rotate the thing, and it was wearing really nicely. It was getting faded and frayed and fragile looking, and really becoming very poignant. And it was supposed to go in a show at the Whitney. And lo and behold, Peter King, congressman from Nassau County, came there and held a little press conference with some war veterans, saying they thought it was a disgrace and it was anti-American, and demanding that C.W. Post remove the piece. Well, C.W. Post, I met with the president of C.W. Post, and we had a really great meeting, and he came out with a statement that stood behind the piece, and we're not going to move it, and so forth. And it sort of died down, and then about 2 or 3 days later, I got a call that the piece had been destroyed. Somebody had gone out there with a box cutter, which they found in the snow, it was in the winter, and just slashed all the flags, which I thought it was actually pretty funny that somebody who thought I was desecrating the flag was out there slashing all the flags. A friend came up with an alternate explanation, said, you don't know why this person did it. Maybe he broke up with his girlfriend and they had a moment there and he was just like letting off steam or something, and it had nothing to do with anything political. But it was just a few days after Peter King's visit.
So a work that preceded that was called White No Tracer, which was a large ball of rope.
A ball of rope.
That was, you all are also extremely clever with your titles. They're very funny. The title came from a Thelonious Monk song.
Yeah, Straight No Chaser.
Straight No Chaser, White No Tracer.
Right.
Right. So that was another, that had more than one life also, because it was originally in England in Gateshead at the National Gardens Fest, and this was a big white ball that was about how big?
11 feet in diameter.
Right. 11 feet in diameter, very carefully put into place, rolled like you said, like a dung beetle would roll.
Right.
And protected with tarp so that it would stay completely pristine. But it came back to you as dirt ball? Is that what you renamed it?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
Okay. It was, they had something called the National Garden Festival in Gateshead, England. And I met a woman who was involved in it, and she said, oh, you have to come over and do some things, and you can work with some British industries. And I went over there and did a visit. In fact, that piece with this piece was the other piece I did at Gateshead, but without the truck. I went to visit a corning factory I believe it was in Manchester, where they were blowing these. And it's actually a guy standing up on a platform with a bunch of assistants blowing these big things. It's remarkable to see. And so I designed this, and they had rhododendrons in it. The other piece I made was this white no tracer. A tracer is sometimes in a rope you see a spiral of a different color, blue or red, going around it, and it's there so that so that sailors, when they're rolling up the rope, can see if there are kinks in it. And when I was ordering the rope, which came from a place called British Rope, I said I wanted 2-inch diameter rope, white, no tracer. And when I said that, I thought, oh, straight, no chaser. And so I called it white, no tracer. And made this great piece. We put it together on this pier called the Dunstan Stave that goes out into the River Tyne, and for centuries, coal cars would come out here and they would dump them into barges. So traditionally, this was a very dirty place. They no longer were doing that at the time. But we didn't put tarps down, but we swept the stave, which is, stave means pier, I guess. And we started out rolling this ball, and we had a couple guys, and we did it over the course of, I think, 3 or 4 days. And every day we added on more guys. So at the end, there were 12 people pushing this ball of rope. It was like the myth of Sisyphus. And I would be behind it, holding the rope and going to the left to the right, and behind me was like a motorized vehicle holding the spool of rope that was unspooling. And we went to every length we could to keep it really, really white. So the show was up for a matter of several months, and then it was time to ship it back to me, and they didn't have money to ship it back as an art object. So what they did is they took it down to their parking lot and unrolled the whole thing and took all the rope and shoved it into a container and sent it back to me. So this piece was also supposed to be in a show at the Whitney. It was in the courtyard in front of the Whitney for one of their biennials. And so I had them deliver this container to PS1, and we took it to their parking lot, and I got a bunch of friends, and we rolled it back up into a ball, and it was filthy at this point, and I put belts on it so that it couldn't be undone again, ever. And I changed the name of it to Dirtball. Yeah.
And that piece still is somewhere?
That piece is at an art park called The Fields of Art Oh My that's up maybe in Ghent or someplace up north west of the Hudson. Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to talk about either materials that you've worked with or the most recent piece, The Cloud? Give me a choice.
Okay.
So materials, candles, shoelaces, ropes, test tubes, cigarettes, razor blades, buoys, equipment from the chemical industry.
I'll talk about The Cloud.
Okay. Okay, so The Cloud, again, is on the cover here. And there's actually an exquisite video that Donald's son, Jackson, pardon me.
Right there.
Jackson made, really, really wonderful video. This in motion, which you have to see it in motion because it is so whimsical. So it's animated by wind and light.
That's right. Okay, they had a competition to make something in a traffic circle in El Paso that's right near the university. It wasn't a university project, it was a city project, but really closely tied to the university. The traffic circle is unusual in that instead of just being lawn or something, it actually is like a cylinder that goes down into the ground, and there is a plaza down there that's part of a pedestrian underpass to get through this fairly wide road. And on one side is parking lots for the university, on the other side is the university. It was an unusual competition. Usually in these competitions you have to propose something. This one, they did telephone interviews. How would you approach this? And I bullshitted something, I don't know, but they chose me. So I went down there to visit. I didn't have an idea in my head. And the first thing they did is they had me visit the university. The University of Texas in El Paso is quite unusual architecturally in that all the buildings are based on architecture from Bhutan.
That's right.
Yeah, Bhutan. It seems like back in the 20s, the wife of the president of the university, there was like a new building that they were going to be building, and the wife of the university president was looking through National Geographic, and she saw an article about Bhutan, which is way up in the Himalayas. And she said, oh, we're like that, because we have mountains here. And she convinced her husband that the building should be Bhutanese architecture. So this started something. and they've become sister cities, and all the architecture is based on Bhutan, and they've brought old historic shrines over to the university, and it permeates the physical plant. So I'm walking around the campus, and in one place I see these Buddhist prayer flags that are basically long sticks with long flags that are fluttering like this. And that was my first idea. Maybe I should do that. And it just, drawing it up, it wasn't really working out. Part of the thing was when they built this structure, they knew they were going to have a sculpture there, and so they put in 3 footings that made a triangle 50 feet on a side. And this is a very difficult thing to deal with. I have to make something, and this is where it's got to meet the ground. So thinking about it, Bhutan is known as the kingdom in the clouds. And I decided I'm going to make a cloud. So from these 3 feet, I made a big structure that's like what would hold up a billboard. And then there are 3 billboard-sized clouds that each cloud is made of little 7 by 7 inch pieces of stainless steel that are hinged so that they can move like that. And each cloud is different. And then they're stainless steel, but then they're painted on both sides in a pattern that came from taking a picture of a cloud and pixelating it so that each piece is like a color pixel. So they range from white to grays to blues and make up this cloud. So that's what the piece is. And it gets incredibly windy there sometime. And when it does, this thing comes alive. It just, it disappears and reappears and flutters and so forth.
So we have a Texas background, both of us. You lived in Houston, and you now have a piece there. They in Houston, the old cisterns in downtown, they opened it up to the public. Only in Texas would they think this would be an attraction. And but they have this great series where they ask artists each year who work with light and sound to do installations in this massive cistern. And you were commissioned to do one it's a periscope that allows you to look down into the cistern at any time of day.
Yeah. Here's how that came about. They were building a new water filtration plant at Lake Houston, which is out on the edge of town. People in Houston, traditionally, if you want water, you would drill a well and start pulling water out of the ground. And people have done this so much that in places the ground has actually sunk 10 feet.
Actually, the petrochemical industry is responsible for that.
That too, yeah. But they decided that we're not going to use what they call groundwater anymore. We're going to use surface water, which means a new filtration plant. And I think they were putting in about 2,000 miles of piping. So what I was going to do in front of this water filtration plant was a bunch of like stainless steel pipes that come up like this, that each one had a clawfoot bathtub on the top of them. So it was like a stalk of, like a bunch of flowers, like a bouquet of bathtubs. And they all had their faucets turned on, so the bathtubs were all overflowing one into another. It was going to be great. It never got built. The reason it didn't get built is Homeland Security came in and said, this plant is not going to be open to the public. So putting public art money there didn't make any sense. So for several years, they looked for another place in Houston to build this thing. And they never came up with anything. Finally, I said, listen, let me propose something else. You give me a site and I'll propose something for it. So they gave me a site at this park called Buffalo Bayou Park. And I went down there to look at it and think about it. And we're walking around the park, and I said, by the way, you know, under this, which is going to be a big performance lawn, there's an underground cistern that was forgotten about and rediscovered when we started building the park. This cistern is 1.5 times the size of a football field. It's Texas scale. And it's the ceiling is 25 feet high. And they said, you want to go down in it? I said, yeah. And we figured that out, and I had to sign releases and all this. We went down in there. It was hot as hell, muggy, and there was no real light, but the hatch was open, and there was some light coming in. We had flashlights down there. Amazing, amazing space. So I said, instead of me making a sculpture in the park, what if I make a periscope to look down into this space? They said, great. And so that's what we did. And I think there was some talk about what to do with the space at that time. They were talking about making it into a parking lot. They were talking about just destroying it. They were talking about all sorts of things. There were some people who were saying, we should really preserve it and make it something. And they raised money to air condition this place, to put in a mezzanine walkway that goes all the way around it. And there are now tours there. They take tours of like 20 or 30 people down there to walk around the thing. Fantastic.
And when it's actually a remarkably beautiful space.
Yeah.
And if they had everyone on the tour yell simultaneously, and your echo lasts 17 seconds, and it sounds like an army of people. It sounds like hell, you know, it's voices
Right.
from hell. But okay, so in a minute I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'll explain to everyone what this means. So, this Donald Lipski sculpture outside the Denver Public Library shares its name with a Marjorie Kinney Rawling work.
That was a Jeopardy question.
Yes. So I don't think many artists today can claim that they were featured on a Jeopardy question under the name Donald.
Right. The category was the Donald. So I'm embarrassed by that.
Yes, but it was this. It's in here, right?
It's this one.
The chair.
It was on
the yearling.
the web thing.
Yeah, the yearling.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna see if we have anyone who wants to set the record straight on anything Donald said. Yes, Joan.
I did some work years ago on Cranbrook, so I'm so curious. Were you a rebel at Cranbrook? What did you do when you were in graduate school there?
Okay.
So should I repeat the question? People here? So it's Joan Martyr. She was asking if Donald was a rebel at Cranbrook when he was studying there.
I was, and in this sense, Cranbrook is in the suburbs of Detroit. It's in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. It's a really idyllic 300-acre campus that has a boys' prep school, a girls' prep school, a science institute, a theological institute, and the Art Academy. The Art Academy is all graduate students. It's about 150 graduate students who are divided into quite rigid media-based categories. There's a painting department, a sculpture department, a weaving department, a metalsmithing department, architecture, etc. I was in the ceramics department. In college, I was ostensibly a history major, but the fact is I was not going to class much at all. I didn't really, but my last year there, I got into a ceramics class and that I lied to get into. I told them I had taken their prerequisites, which I hadn't. And I got inspired by a man named Don Reitz, who was a romantic, extraordinary potter. So when I got to Cranbrook, I didn't know anything about art, really, you know. And I was the ceramics teacher, Richard DeVore, took me literally by the hand after about 2 weeks and walked me over and introduced me to the sculpture teacher. And I started going to sculpture critiques. I started going to weaving critiques, painting critiques. I started working with the photography department. I was doing stuff all over the academy, which was very unusual. So in that sense, I was a rebel. I was doing things out in the fields there and just discovering art because I didn't know anything about it. I was like a little sponge. And when Art Forum came out, you wouldn't see me for a couple days because I was reading everything because I just wanted to know about art. So that was what my Cranbrook experience was like. It was great. It really formed me in a lot of ways. Yeah, no, she had been Richard DeVore's teacher. Yeah, so she was gone, but I met her. She came by, you know. Gerhard Nodell was the fiber teacher. George Ortman was the painting teacher. Michael Hall was the sculpture teacher. All extraordinary people.
We have a question here.
I'm thinking of something that has inspired me that may inspire you as an Amagansett resident for many years. I take my garbage to the recycling center. And initially, during your presentation of what you do, I'm thinking of this actually horrible place that needs something, and there's so much there. Have you ever thought about it and the forces that would be working with you in the town of East Town?
So the question is, do you want to do a public artwork at the demo?
Oh, yeah, I would be open to that. I'd be open to that. At our house, we have 2 bird feeders hanging in the trees that are made from, when you see high power lines, sometimes they're hanging with insulators, ceramic insulators. That's what these bird feeders are made out of. At my truck in Southampton, there's a sculpture that's made out of copper cable that I got from there. I think I've probably made some other things from there over the years. In the early days, when we lived here, I don't think we had garbage pickup, and we had to take our stuff there. And so it was a weekly thing. I would go there, and I would bring stuff, and I would take stuff. It was sort of a swap system. Pound for pound, I probably took more than I left. Yeah.
Perfect space.
Yeah.
How often do you visit your truck?
It's an excellent question.
How often does he visit his truck?
There have been summers, we're only here in the summer. Our house closes up in the winter. There have been summers when I never went by there. And there have been other summers when I went there because I knew there was something I needed, or something was coming back from some exhibition and I had to have a place to put it. I have storage in Philadelphia. I have storage in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Until recently, I had storage in Houston. Really, until a year ago, I had stuff stored there. Louise Bourgeois, when asked for advice that she could give young sculptors, she said, "Get lots of storage space." Yeah.
Well, I think, oh, one more question?
I'm so intrigued how you, in some ways, you're sort of like I don't know if anarchy is the way to say it, but without rules, and yet you work within systems that have all these rules. So you have an interesting combination as an artist and conceptualist. But my question, getting to it, is: do you actually love working yourself with hands-on, getting in it, or is it more the I see what can be done, I'm going to get this person to do this? Because you seem to be wonderful at directing and collaborating, which is, I believe in that as an artist doing that. That's still that artist's vision. So, do you get the question? Yeah.
So the question, I'll repeat it because
you seem to translate really well.
well, the question is that you started out working very actively with your hands, and now you're kind of working on a scale that requires fabrication and engineers and collaborators. So where are you comfortable?
Yeah.
There's a key question, and it's really, it really gets to the heart of me in a lot of ways. I love working with my hands and building stuff myself, and I hardly do it at all. Because we have a house, I'm fixing stuff around the house. That's what I do with my hands, and I love it when there's something that has to be done. I take a lot of joy in it. I, from time to time, still make stuff. In the last couple years, I've done a couple projects working with glass blowers, where they're doing most of it, but I'm still pretty hands-on. And from time to time, I think of something I want to make. But my energies have really gone into this public art thing, which means that my days are spent sitting at the computer, talking on the telephone, flying around to meet with people. But that's what I've chosen. I've chosen it for a few reasons. One is building things with my hands, I think, got easy. I know how to do it. The things that were coming out might be a little different than anything I've ever made, but it's all sort of in a realm where doing the public art is really hard. It's hard because I've got to follow rules, not my rules, but the rules of reality. It's hard because I've got to satisfy maybe a committee that committees tend to water things down and bring them to the lowest common denominator. It's hard because of 1,000 reasons, but I love it. And I like it being hard. It's like those of you who do the crossword puzzle. As the week goes by, it gets to be more and more fun. When you get to Thursday, then that's really doing the puzzle. Friday, Saturday, hang on, baby. I like it when things are hard. The other thing about public art is it's important. The way it exists in the world is very different than the way art exists in a gallery or in a museum. Now, I still show my work in galleries, although not that much, because I'm not making that much. And I love that world, even though there's a lot of things that are problematic about it. It's very much about money, which I have nothing against money, But public art, it's out there, it's free, it's for everybody. There's something really democratic about it, and it has the possibility to really enrich people's lives, to become touchstones and landmarks, and to take an ordinary place and make it special. So I don't work with my hands that much, but
Thank you, no, that was very inspiring.
But-
Thank you.
yeah.
That was a good question. So I think we're going to end it there, and I just want to thank the Art Barge for continuing this series. Chris,